Okay, good afternoon, everyone. And let's carry on our discussion about epidemiology and also about disease itself and some of the features of disease progress and everything. So we finished off here last time looking at these graphs. These are recent, very recent graphs. These are of COVID-19 prevalence and incidence. And I showed you this to show you different ways in which data can be reported by epidemiologists in order to try to predict trends, etc. This is a simple prevalence. It's the number of cases occurring, and each hopefully accurately reflecting for each day how many cases were recorded. But you'll notice that the data is noisy. You see these regular spikes here. These can reflect actual disease process, epidemiological features, but very often this also relates to data reporting, to the nature of data reporting. And so a lot of this noise here is not giving us useful information. And you don't want to pay attention to this noise. What you want to be paying attention to is the overall trend here. And we can do that statistically, because what we can do is what has been done here, where we have a rolling 7-day average. Every data point is an average of 7 days previous data. And that neatly smooths the graph out, avoids all this noise that you can see in the background, and it gives you a much better idea of the trends that you are looking at. Unfortunately, this is the trend for COVID-19 at the moment. This is the latest data point here was November 8th when I pulled this graph off the web, and you can see very easily what the progress of this epidemic in the United States has been. We started off at the beginning of the year with first entry, probably late January. It's not exactly clear when. Very, very few cases, and then very rapidly an increase during the spring. This was the spring burst. Now this is nationwide. You'll remember that, in fact, a lot of this, for example, happened right here in New York. So the state was extremely hard hit, even though this looks like, compared to the rest of the graph that you see, what's coming, this looks like it wasn't so bad. In fact, it was extremely bad. Remembering that local impact can be immense where national impact is not that great. This is the spring. We went in then nationwide. We went into the summer. New York avoided much of the summer burst, which has hit the rest of the nation very, very hard. And the reason for that was New York listened to the scientists, to the epidemiologists. And by and large, in New York, people were extremely good about wearing masks, social distancing, hand washing, etc. As you will have realized, if you were here over the summer, and the streets were empty, there was no bars open, no restaurants open, nowhere where people could gather and pass the virus one person to the other. In the rest of the nation, unfortunately, that was not the case. Much of the nation is still not observing these recommended guidelines for mask wearing, social distancing, etc. And this is the result. This was something of a surprise to some scientists who had hoped that during the summer the numbers would drop. This increase here in the fall and winter has been predicted right the way from back here. This is a typical pattern here for respiratory illnesses, that they increase in autumn and winter. The reasons are not always absolutely clear. It certainly has something to do with the fact that people begin to spend more time indoors, and they are more likely to come into close contact with other people during winter. It also probably has something to do with the survival of the virus in the atmosphere. The virus is spread through droplets contact, and in winter, the droplets last longer. They're suspended in the air longer, and they are available for inhalation for a longer time. That's the theory. Whatever it is, we are seeing a catastrophic increase in numbers now in the fall, and this will certainly persist into the winter. You can see here it's virtually exponential. Again, this is nationwide. We definitely are seeing an increase here in New York, but it is not as grave as it is elsewhere. But we need to remember that the rest of the country doesn't stay put necessarily, they travel. And people can certainly bring in the virus if they come into New York to see the Christmas decorations or whatever it is. They are traveling the virus with them. This is why the recommendations are that travel be severely limited over this coming holiday period, both Thanksgiving and Christmas. So this is real. This is our current life that we're seeing here displayed for us as a rolling 7-day average of case counts of COVID-19. And you can see that we have passed 100,000 cases per 7-day average. So this represents a prodigious 57%, the state was a 57% increase over a 7-day period. This is not good news. Those of you from the heartland need to be contacting your families and telling them the virus is real. It can be, its spread can be limited by good mask usage, social distancing, hand washing. Simple things. Yes, we're all hoping for the vaccine, but the vaccine may not be available to us before late spring or summer next year. It's a long time to go when you're looking at an exponential spread like this. Okay. So properly, I hesitate a little bit because I'm trying to be very careful not to wander into areas of sensitivity. Unfortunately, where normally a pandemic or epidemic of this sort would be dealt with by health authorities, and people would be following the guidelines of scientists who have studied this for their entire lives and understand these patterns really well. Unfortunately, this pandemic has become caught up in politics, and politicians are making health decisions which are not necessarily judicious. I'll put it that way. Properly, we would normally send all of this data to this very important and formerly world-renowned government agency, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, commonly known as the CDC, which is in Atlanta, Georgia. This houses some of the most renowned epidemiologists in the world. And normally we look to the CDC to be alerted to the fact that a disease is getting hold. We look to the CDC to tell us and what its track is and to make predictions. We also look to the CDC to make recommendations to us. about how to respond. It acts in coordination with this institute, the National Institute for Allergic and Infectious Disease, NIAID, and that is where the famous Dr. Fauci works. So the Center for Disease Control and NIAID, together, they are our principal repository of immunological knowledge, and they are responsible for collecting and analyzing all the epidemiological information. And then NIAID in particular makes recommendations for therapeutic responses, etc. The CDC publishes every week one of the most important epidemiological bulletins in the world. It is picked up and followed all over the world, and this is it's called the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. And in it, they provide a summary of all of the current observations of disease in the United States. Morbidity refers to the incidence of a specific disease, a specific notifiable disease. A notifiable disease is one where you are required to send information to the CDC. And they are monitoring the whole time the incidence of particular diseases. They are also monitoring the mortality, and that is the number of deaths that result. I will just say something about the term mortality. Realize that there's two ways, there's actually more than two ways, there's various ways of reporting mortality. But the first way, the one that we're most familiar with, is actually called the case mortality. That is the number of people who die who have contracted a disease. So that is the case mortality. But there is also like a population mortality. That is, the case mortality tells you what your risk of dying is if you contract the disease. Population mortality tells you what your overall risk of dying from that disease is. It's the number of deaths per population of set area. So we would say for the population of the United States, the population of New York or whatever. So those, by the way, you'll often see it referred to as the MMWR, and it's really like a mini Bible of epidemiology. It's very, very closely, normally very, very closely followed. So the government actually decides what diseases doctors will need to report to a CDC. And the CDC then compounds all of the statistics. They determine a morbidity rate, number of people affected in relation to population for a particular time period, and they will compound the mortality rate as well. You need to pay close attention to the fact that these two need to be considered together. So, for example, let's have a look at two diseases. One of them entered the United States and is a periodic disease, periodically epidemic. Let's put it that way. It rears its ugly head every now and again, and that is West Nile disease. And West Nile disease can produce a particular disease syndrome called West Nile encephalitis. And there is a mortality risk associated with the morbidity. It was 5,674 cases in the United States in 2012. So that was the relative morbidity. And mortality was 286 cases. There is another disease which is really endemic, and this is a disease called listeriosis. And listeriosis is a bacterial disease from a bacterium called Listeria, usually acquired through food. And it's not very common these days, but it does occur. And there were 121 cases in 2012 in the United States. So it's an uncommon disease, but 13 people died. Now, just looking at that, which of these two diseases does it seem would be more likely to be fatal? Well, West Nile produced 286 fatalities. Listeriosis was only 13. So on the face of it, it looks like West Nile encephalitis is more likely, right? But when you work these out as a percentage of one, you remember, we have to look at the mortality in relationship to the morbidity. And when we work out the actual mortality, the case mortality rate for West Nile encephalitis is 5%. When you work out the case mortality rate for listeriosis, it's 11%. Much, much higher, more than twice. So in fact, listeriosis, even though it has so few cases per year, in fact, is much more likely to be fatal. So just think about this. If you were actually working in a health department, all right, and you had to make decisions, okay, they give you a limited budget. And they say, here, you've got X amount of dollars to spend, dedicated to some particular disease or other. Which of these two would you dedicate your money to? Do you dedicate it to the one where it has such a high morbidity but a lower mortality? Or do you dedicate it to something that has a lower morbidity but a higher mortality? These are real decisions that people actually have to make, especially when a budget becomes limited. So with that, I must tell you also that this is a real lesson in the fragility of scientific work. But unfortunately, the politicization of the COVID crisis has resulted in a massive loss of confidence in the functioning of this government agency. And this has been I'm not telling you this because of my own personal political views. I'm just telling you this because I want you to realize what a huge impact an organization like the CDC has had for decades. It has been highly respected, and its word has been adhered to. If the CDC says behave in this way, people behave that way. They regarded it as being authoritative. That authority, unfortunately, since the beginning of the year, has been considerably eroded. And this is one of the reasons why people feel that they do not have to obey, or that they don't have to follow recommendations any longer. They basically say, what do scientists know? Well, before, we paid very close attention to what scientists at the CDC knew. Nowadays, people feel free to simply ignore it, no matter how high or low they are in society. And this is the result. This is the result. Here in New York, we managed to avoid this entire increase, almost entire, avoided over summer, because people adhered to the recommendations. Now the rest of the nation needs to learn that same lesson. And we who are sick and tired of wearing our masks, sick and tired of never seeing our friends, etc., we need to just buckle down and repeat what we did here. Wear your mask, wash your hands, socially distance until something else comes along, which we'll talk about in a second. Okay, so also, I'm afraid, a highly political issue, but one that you need to understand, is this idea of herd immunity. So here is a simple explanation, a graphic explanation for you what herd immunity means. Herd immunity refers to the prevalence of immunity to a particular disease in a population, and particularly in a population where disease can pass from person to person in that population. So let's have a look and see the different scenarios. First of all, here is a population. The vast majority are not immunized. They are healthy, but they are not immune to disease, to a particular disease. That disease enters. Well, how does this contagious disease spread? It spreads from person to person. There is a chain of infection from somebody who's infected to someone who is uninfected. That person becomes infected, passes it to others. They pass it to others. They pass it to others. And pretty soon it's exponential spread through a vulnerable population. And a huge number of people do get it. There may be a few people who are genetically predisposed to being resistant to infection. They manage to evade infection, but the vast majority of the population eventually becomes infected in this scenario. Now, the concept of herd immunity arose from vaccine studies, because vaccines confer an artificial immunity. They can make you immune to disease even if you had never suffered from that disease. In this scenario, these people all suffer from the disease. They may or may not acquire immunity. In the vaccine model, what was realized was that the people who are vaccinated, who are immunized, cannot get the disease. And because they can't get the disease, they can't spread the disease. Okay, so the question was asked, how, if we only have a few people in the population, right, who are vaccinated, you've still got a huge vulnerable population. And the vulnerable population, if they are infected, they will perform the same kind of spread as in it spreads through this population just the same as it does here. And all of these people end up being infected. They all end up being infected. People who are not infected are the people who were immunized, but in this scenario here, they are very few. They're just few and far between. The vaccine herd immunity model said, if we can get enough people vaccinated through the population, then look what happens. Who is here in this scenario? Who is vulnerable? The unvaccinated people, there in blue, who are either unvaccinated or their vaccination did not confer immunity, which does happen. So in any population, you may have vulnerable people, even if you were to vaccinate all of them. Some of them would remain vulnerable. But look what happens. We bring an infected person, but there's no chain of contagion. There's no chain of contagion from this infected person to the vulnerable people, because so many people here are immune. The disease can't spread through a population which is immune to it. And because it can't spread, if you have enough people who are immune, you interrupt the chain of contagion, and the disease can't spread, and the disease ultimately dies out because it does not have a host population that it can move into. So this is the concept of herd immunity. It is a concept which is related strictly to vaccines, to a situation where we have an artificial means of conferring immunity. But unfortunately, this has been latched onto as this dream idea that what we can do is we can allow the disease to spread through our population. So this diagram is a diagram of how they had hoped herd immunity would work for COVID-19, that we have people who are infected. But if we've had many people in the population who have had COVID and are now immune, then the disease can't spread to the few vulnerable people who haven't had it. Okay, sounds reasonable, right? Because it sounds very much like it sounds like this, excepting that in this model here, we artificially immunize people with a vaccine. Instead, the herd immunity, the COVID-19 herd immunity guys say what we need to do is we need to let the disease spread naturally. Even if we don't have a vaccine, we let the disease spread naturally. We encourage people to get infected because then we have lots and lots of immune people and they will protect the few vulnerable people who are left in the population. Well, let's work it out, okay? Let's just work it out. You can, one of the problems with COVID-19 is it's an extremely contagious disease. It does not have a very high, it doesn't case mortality rate, but it does have a huge morbidity. Millions of people are being infected by COVID-19. So even if it's got a low mortality rate, a lot of people can die. So let's work it out for the United States population. The current population in the United States is about 331 million people. You can work out how many people you need to be immune to achieve herd immunity. It depends on lots of things, but you can work it out. And for COVID-19, it's around about, we would need around about 65%. Some people put it higher, but let's just be generous and take the lower estimate and say, okay, we need 65% of the population to be immune to the disease, to establish herd immunity, at which point we would see the epidemic die. Fine. So 65% of the population is 215,150,000. The case fatality rate is about 2%. Okay, so that's 2%. 2% of this is 4,303,000. Currently, we are sitting at we're approaching 250,000 deaths. When I did work the sum out, it was at 237,815. Our current mortality rate is about 1,000 a day. Okay, so all of the people who've died so far represent 0.001. 0.1% of what is needed to establish herd immunity. Dr. Atlas, who is on the COVID-19 Presidential Advisory Board, is asking us to establish herd immunity by getting infected, by allowing the population in general to become infected. And what they're asking us to do is to sustain a fatality rate 1,000 times what we've suffered already. 1,000 times. This is not a sensible recommendation. And when people talk to you now about herd immunity and what a great idea it is that everybody gets infected, so we establish herd immunity, just realize in human populations, we almost never establish herd immunity through natural diseases. It just doesn't happen. And herd immunity, this idea of herd immunity is something which relates to our ability to actually confer artificial immunity by means of vaccination. What we're doing then is we're establishing herd immunity by using a harmless means, but a vaccine which is not going to cause illness, is not going to have morbidity associated with it, let alone a mortality. So yes, they have this great, it sounds good on paper, but it really, this is its effect, an awful lot of dead people to achieve that. And that in no population anywhere in the world could sustain a mortality rate that huge without massive impacts on the population itself, on the functioning of the society itself. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the progress of disease, the process of disease itself. Again, there are just some terms that we have to get straight, and so I'll try and illustrate them wherever I can. So an acute disease is a disease where the symptoms develop very rapidly, but the disease only lasts a short time. COVID would be one, influenza another. So a chronic disease is one where symptoms develop slowly and often where people become progressively debilitated. A good example of that would be tuberculosis, a very slow progressing infection, which can ultimately become fatal and is certainly very debilitating over time, but may take years to become so. A subacute disease is intermediate between the two. So it is a disease such as, for example, Lyme disease, where Lyme disease, very often people only suffer a little acute episode and then it passes and they don't have anything more. But in some people, they develop an ongoing infection, which has important sequelae. Sequelae are consequences, bad consequences of a disease that will last even after the infection. So Lyme disease, for example, somebody suffering from established Lyme disease infection may have a year or two of intense problems and then maybe pass off with some after effects. That would be a typical subacute disease. A latent disease is different. A latent disease is one where you have a causative agent, but it remains inactive, completely silent, but is then activated and produces symptoms. In human beings, the one really important example of this are the herpes viruses, because a number of the herpes viruses, actually, we have an acute episode with the virus, and then it retreats and it actually integrates with human cells, goes completely silent, and then many years later, at some later stage, it can reactivate again. A good example of this would be the disease chickenpox, which we have an initial acute disease, chickenpox, that lasts 2-3 weeks in children and then passes off, and they go the rest of their lives with no appearance of disease whatsoever. But then in their middle age or old age, sometimes younger, but usually middle age, old age, the virus can reactivate and it appears as the disease of shingles. And that is simply that it has remained latent. If you have ever had cold sores on your mouth, that's another example. Once you've had the infection, it's also called by a herpes virus. You have an initial acute episode where you have sores on your mouth or whatever, and then, after 10 days, 2 weeks, whatever, it disappears completely. Well, it hasn't gone away, it has gone latent. It remains actually in the nerve endings around your mouth and can reappear. Why it reappears is often a mystery. Some times people say it's due to stress or whatever, but we don't really know. We don't really know why it is that all of a sudden these diseases can flare up again. So a lot depends also on the host response to the disease as to how it progresses. Very often, our immune system or our immune protections are good enough that we will limit the scope of an infection to a particular part of the body. It may be quite intense where it occurs, but it does not spread generally. And a good example of this, a good example actually throughout, it would be streptococcus. Streptococcus actually is part of our normal nasal flora, for example. But every now and again, a circumstance can arise where streptococcus will actually form a focus of infection. In strep throat, it infects the mucous membranes of the throat and causes an intensely painful sore throat. It has a very distinctive look. When the doctor looks at it, he just says, oh yes, you've got strep throat, because it has, you can actually see colonies, the bacteria basically growing on the throat. But it doesn't spread any further than that. And that is largely because your immune system reacts very, very strongly. In fact, a lot of the pain associated with it, the inflammation, is due to your immune system reacting to the presence of these now pathogenic streptococcus bacteria. But streptococcus can also spread. It can spread systemically. It can enter the bloodstream and form an infection throughout the body. That would be, if it was circulating, it could end up producing a systemic generalized infection. Normally, however, we think of systemic infections as being those things like, especially the viral infections such as influenza. It's not limited to one focus. Even though you may have symptoms somewhere that draw your attention, influenza, for example, actually affects widely. It affects cells widely throughout the body. It is systemic. A focal infection is one which begins as a local infection and then spreads from there. And my example of streptococcal throat might be an example. You might also think, for example, about somebody being wounded in their hand or whatever, getting a bacterial infection, and then the bacterial infections entering the bloodstream and spreading throughout the body. That produces can produce some very, very serious consequences. Bacteria in the blood, for any reason, we refer to as bacteremia. And that is simply the presence of bacteria in the blood, often very, very temporary. And I'll give you a good example of bacteremia. We have bacteremia, we have a brief burst of bacteremia virtually every time you floss your teeth, because bacteria enter the bloodstream. It's not any consequence whatsoever because your immune system responds immediately and deals with them. You also have bacteremia if you go and have dental work. You will have a brief period of bacteremia afterwards, from if you had any wounding of the gums or whatever. It's no problem because the bacteria don't breed and the immune system deals with them really quickly, eliminates them. Bacteria can grow in the bloodstream. They can grow. They can enter the bloodstream and actually use it as an environment, not only to spread to other parts of the body, but to grow within the bloodstream itself. And that is a special condition which we call septicemia. Common parlance, blood poisoning, but it's actual population increase of bacteria in the bloodstream. And this has to be distinguished. Septicemia, which is the growth of bacteria in the bloodstream and also disseminated through the body. This has to be distinguished from this very, very special circumstance, which is called sepsis. You will most commonly hear about sepsis in connection with childbirth, because the condition post-puerperal fever or post-puerperal sepsis is the result of bacteria spreading into a mother's body through the uterus and whatever after childbirth. Sepsis is a very specialized condition. It is a response of the immune system, especially to the spread of gram-negative bacteria. They provoke it most strongly. They're not the only ones that provoke it, but they are very commonly implicated in sepsis. And it is a generalized inflammatory condition, which is a response to the presence of bacteria in the bloodstream. I just want to remind you what happens during inflammation. During the normal inflammation reaction, cells of the immune system release histamine. The histamine dilates blood vessels. They usually do it locally. If you get a wound on your hand, it will just be a little tiny patch around the wound. They release histamine. They make the blood vessels leaky. The blood vessels leak serum, which contains all sorts of useful compounds for fighting bacteria. And locally, if you just dilate the blood vessels like this, the blood pressure in that immediate area drops because you've dilated the blood vessel. So now imagine that we do that globally, through the whole body. Through the whole body, we cause all the blood vessels of the body to dilate. We cause all the blood vessels of the body to become leaky and start pouring serum into the surrounding tissues. What happens is we produce a condition of shock. It's shock because the blood pressure collapses catastrophically. And this is what we refer to as toxic shock. Toxic shock syndrome, for example, is the result of this kind of global reaction of the body to the presence of toxins released by bacteria. You get the same thing by the body reacting to the presence of gram-negative bacteria, for example. And this is an emergency situation, and very frequently fatal. A very frequently fatal over response of the immune system to toxins, gram-negative bacteria, various other things in the blood. That having toxins circulating is referred to as toxemia. Very commonly, this is from the whole group of organisms, the Clostridia, and from other bacteria such as anthrax. Various bacteria can produce toxins which circulate through the body and cause reactions. Viremia is the circulation of virus in the body. So many infections begin as a primary infection. So, for example, influenza would be a good example of a primary infection. But as you know, it is quite common after influenza, even after a severe cold or whatever, that tissues damaged by the disease, like the throat, for example, or parts of the respiratory tract, become vulnerable to other infections, especially to bacterial infections, and those we would refer to as secondary infections. Very often, these are opportunistic infections. They're often bacteria which would not normally cause that much of a problem, but they take the opportunity of being able to infect damaged tissues, for example, of the throat or of the bronchi, somewhere like that, and you end up with a secondary infection. The primary infection was the influenza. Secondary infection is one which follows that primary infection, and often as a result of damage caused by the primary. Probably one of the most dangerous are bacterial infections deep in the lungs, especially in the alveoli of the lung tissue, which are normally kept sterile. But following a primary infection, very frequently, it can predispose you towards bacterial infection deep in the lungs, and that can produce a pneumonia. In young people, this is often very easily treated. But in the elderly, pneumonia of this kind, often caused by a bacterium called pneumococcus, this can actually be fatal. The pneumococcus, by the way, is another Streptococcus pneumoniae. And in elderly people, this is often a fatal consequence of something like a cold or flu. Subclinical disease is one where there are no noticeable signs or symptoms, but there is an infection. So if there are any symptoms, they are so mild that the person is barely aware of them or unaware of them. But the really important thing about this is that people with subclinical disease can actually be spreading disease. And that is, again, in COVID-19, this is a major epidemiological consideration, that there are people who are infected and are infectious, who have no awareness of the fact that that is the case. That subclinical period may pass. They may go on from there to become symptomatic, but sometimes they do not. Sometimes the subclinical phase is all that they have. It then dies out, or they maintain it for a long time. So what are as far as disease is concerned, what are the predisposing factors? There are many, 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 many of them. Your gender is a major one. And people suffer predominantly from different diseases depending on what gender you are. They may have inherited traits which predispose them to disease, such as sickle cell disease. In the case of many cancers now, such as breast cancers, we are discovering that there are inherited factors which predispose people to those. We place an inordinate amount of importance on climate and weather. It's actually not nearly as directly important as you would think. We say, oh, I caught a cold because I went out in the rain. I got flu because I got cold skiing or whatever. There's no direct association like that. But climate and weather do have an impact because they actually can affect, for example, the survival of an infectious agent in the air, and things like that. This becomes very important with respiratory diseases because fall and winter, most respiratory viruses, for example, can survive in the air for much longer than they do during the summer. Sunlight is a great disinfectant. And so in winter, there is less daylight and the sunlight is less direct. And so the disinfectant nature of the sunlight, largely due to its ultraviolet components, is much less. This is a huge one. For many, many, many diseases, we have been able to almost either completely vanquish them or limit their occurrence by good vaccination programs. Unfortunately, many of these vaccination programs are now becoming unpopular for various reasons. And in those areas where people are not vaccinated or their children are not vaccinated, many diseases, measles, mumps, these kind of diseases are making an epidemic reappearance. So lack of vaccination is definitely a predisposing factor to getting the disease. Fatigue and stress appear to both be extremely important, and it's in predisposing people to illness. And both fatigue and stress, surprisingly enough, the effects can be relieved by regular exercise. If you are in a stressful job with great demands on your time, if you take the time to exercise properly, you can alleviate a lot of the impacts of this. Age is probably one of the greatest predisposing factors. As you get older, you simply become more and more vulnerable to disease, even to diseases, infectious diseases to which you had been previously exposed or vaccinated can become important. And that is simply because our immune systems age. As we age, just as all of the cells of our body age, so does our immune system. And it becomes less and less effective as time goes. Not ineffective, but less effective as time goes on. Lifestyles, well, there are a number of things about lifestyle. First of all, probably one of the most important is smoking, still. Smoking is incredibly dangerous undertaking. Smoking and using snuffs and tobacco, chewing tobacco is what the word I'm trying to think of. All of these things are, these are not good substances. And the disease association is quite clear. Alcohol, well, there's a number of recommendations about alcohol out there, but the most important thing to remember about alcohol, there's only one safe drinking level, and that is to not drink. But a moderate drinking is not, appears to have, in fact, appears to have some benefits. But they keep changing what they mean by moderate drinking. It used to be moderate drinking was, for men, was 2 drinks a day, for women 1 drink a day, but that has now been cut down. And it's now, I think, something like 3 or 4 drinks a week for men and 2 drinks a week for women, something like that. In other words, we don't really know what a safe level is. We know that we can tolerate a certain level without serious consequences, but a heavy drinking predisposes to a vast array of diseases. The next is nutrition, and this we could have a whole lecture on, because nutrition, bad nutrition, is so very, very common these days. Unfortunately, foods which are very high in fats, salt, this sort of thing, we as human beings have a great taste for fat, for the richness that fat conveys to a food. And we seem to prefer fatty meats and things like that. We also quite like high salt content. All of these things are actually very deleterious to the health. And unfortunately, these foods that are high in fat, high in salt, are also very cheap. So many people eat a lot of them simply because it doesn't cost them much. Whereas people may find that buying decent vegetables, buying decent fruits, these sort of things are actually quite expensive. But that is what we actually, the healthiest diets are those with very small amounts of fat, very small amounts of animal proteins, that sort of thing, and much higher in vegetables and fruits and nuts. But unfortunately, we first of all have a predilection for those cheap foods. They taste good. Hamburgers, etc., etc. Oh, tastes good. Pizza, lovely. Why? Oh, it's all full of fat and salt and everything else. Just what the human palate likes. But unfortunately, a constant diet like that is extremely, extremely damaging. The last one is one which you need to bear in mind, especially if you're in the health sciences, is that many people are undergoing chemotherapies of one sort, and not only for cancers, just true for cancers and for transplant, that sort of thing. But many, many chemotherapies of various kinds will impact especially on the immune system and reduce its efficacy and predispose people to illness. So let's have a look. When you actually do have an illness, what is the progress of that illness? Well, first of all, let me just say, yeah, with this, we need to bear in mind when we're thinking about dealing with the current pandemic. So keep that in mind all the way through. But this applies to many, many infectious diseases. So first of all, there's a point at which you become infected. When you're initially infected with something, various things can happen. If you have it depends very much on the infectious agent as to how much you need to acquire in order to establish disease. Sometimes there's some infectious agents, such as, for example, the measles virus. You need very, very little, very, very few to establish infection. Other things, like let's think like a bacterial food poisoning, for example. You need a huge amount of you need to take in, because they've got to get past the acids in your stomach in order to establish in your gut. So it depends a lot on the actual infectious agent as to how much you must take in to establish an infection. But it's very, very seldom one or two. You're very often talking thousands or millions of cells or infectious particles that you need to take in order to begin establishing an infection. If it establishes, then you'll have a brief period of incubation when you have no signs or symptoms. Now, I'll use here the example just of an ordinary cold. Cold virus. There are many, many viruses which can cause the symptoms of a cold, but we're all familiar with the progress of a cold. Your initial incubation period, the virus has infected you, and it's beginning to establish itself, and it's beginning to reproduce. As the numbers increase, it begins to do its damage. And at the same time, your immune system begins to realize that it's present. Those two things together may produce this little period here. It's called the prodromal period. And it's when you are basically, often you're aware that there's something going on. You're not feeling ill, but something has changed. Maybe you've got a scratchy throat, right? Or something like that, your mild headache or something. You know your body. And you move into this brief period where you're pretty much certain something's going on, but you don't necessarily know what. And then the disease symptoms begin. The virus, or whatever it is reproducing wildly. It is taking over functions of cells in your body. It is damaging cells. You're getting waste products produced. You're now starting to feel really ill. But the most important thing that is happening here in this period of illness is that your immune system is getting geared up. It takes 5 to 10 days for your immune system to react strongly to the presence of an infectious agent such as the cold virus and begin to produce effective antibody, for example, to that virus. Many of the things that your immune system does make you feel bad. For example, it's your immune system that is driving your temperature up. Viruses don't work that well at a higher temperature, but your immune system does. And it's your immune system that raises your body temperature so that you feel really ill. It's often your immune system that increases the size of the dilation of blood vessels in your nasal passages, your sinuses, your head, and gives you that headache, a sinusy headache and everything. That's not to say that some of the symptoms aren't directly due to the infectious agent. The streaming of our nasal passages is a mixture of damage caused by the virus and an immune response on the mucous membrane to try to flush everything out, flush the infectious agent away. After about 5 to 10 days, usually, the immune system has produced enough antibody, and its response is strong enough that it begins to eliminate the virus, and the signs and symptoms begin to decrease. You may still be feeling rocky, you may still be feeling ill, but eventually you reach a point where you're very distinctly healing, and that's the period of convalescence. And for this entire period here, you are suffering signs and symptoms of the disease, but always remember they're a mixture of things. It's not just the infectious agent causing damage, it's also your immune system responding to the presence. So some of those signs and symptoms you might want to watch really carefully, especially temperature. People, as soon as they get a temperature, they tend to rush to the Tylenol bottle. It might be a good idea to actually allow the body to proceed with its normal immune responses. If your temperature becomes uncontrollably high, if you start to get chills, for example, or become confused, then it might be the point at which you might want to lower the temperature. But otherwise, very often, our interventions here do not help the body in getting rid of the infectious agent. Okay, so for any infection, it has to come into the population from somewhere. These diseases do not just appear out of nowhere. Okay, there's no spontaneous generation of infectious agents that will suddenly begin. They come from somewhere. And they very often, these diseases, especially which move with regularity through the human population, they have an origin very often in what we refer to as a reservoir. There is a group of organisms which are susceptible to that disease where it is maintained and then periodically moves out to the rest of the population. So there are very definitely human reservoirs for certain diseases. One of the most famous is a disease called typhoid fever, which is caused by a bacterium, Salmonella. And Salmonella, it's often, I hesitate, it's often called Salmonella typhi. It's not really Salmonella typhi, but anyway, it's a Salmonella bacterium. But in some people who have had the disease of typhoid fever, they maintain a population of Salmonella bacteria in their gallbladders without any effect on them whatsoever. And they act as carriers. They can continually spread the disease to other people without even knowing it. The most famous example of this is here in New York, on Long Island, and in New York was Typhoid Mary, who was a housekeeper in the late 19th century, and she was a typhoid carrier, and she worked widely in New York, Long Island, and everywhere she went, people died of typhoid fever. And it's a lengthy and sad story, which I'll probably tell you when we discuss gut bacteria. So very commonly in human disease, an animal reservoir exists where a disease will be maintained in the animal population, often with no effect to the animal population. And the animal population then has to transmit it back into the human population periodically. There are numerous examples of this. And the best known for us is influenza. Influenza is actually a disease which resides in populations, especially of poultry. Poultry, pigs, and human beings are the three major hosts, and the influenza virus moves between those. So even if we eliminate influenza in the human population, there are animal reservoirs which regularly reinfect the human population. Another famous example for you would be Ebola. Ebola is a disease which we believe is the reservoir of bats. And even when it's eliminated in the human population, it regularly moves back into the human population from contact with bats. COVID-19 is another one. COVID-19 is believed to have arisen also in bats. And again, it's quite likely that it is maintained in the bat population and only occasionally enters the human population. But notice, if there is no animal reservoir, then for a disease to be maintained, there has to be a human reservoir or some other reservoir of the disease. And this is why, for example, we can look to the elimination of diseases. And the really good example is smallpox. The smallpox is a virus, and for millennia, it's been regarded as a plague disease, which moves rapidly through populations almost on a yearly basis in Europe. And then periodically, there would be a huge outbreaks, a high mortality. People are terrified of it because it also disfigures, has the capability of disfiguring very seriously. But smallpox is a human disease. It is a purely human disease. There is no animal reservoir for smallpox. And so the hope was that once you've eliminated it from the human population, it's gone forever. There's no reservoir for smallpox. And that is indeed the case. Vigorous vaccination campaigns led to the demise of smallpox as a human disease. It no longer exists as a human disease. It was declared dead in 1976. And the only source of virus is actually virus which is being kept in freezers in laboratories, in a few laboratories. And even that, many scientists would like to see that removed. It does not exist as a human disease anymore. There are, however, infectious agents which can survive in a non-living reservoir. So, for example, a very good example would be the disease, the bacterium which causes cholera. That is Vibrio cholerae. Vibrio cholerae is actually a normal part, often of estuarine, brackish water, and it's a normal part of the bacterial flora. But under certain circumstances, it blooms, it reaches high population levels, and if human beings drink that water, they get the disease cholera. It produces a violent diarrhea, which often then recontaminates water sources, and it begins to spread from person to person. So that would be a good example of a non-living reservoir, would be Vibrio cholerae. So in between my last slide and this one, there's a detailed table of numerous diseases which we can acquire from animal reservoirs. And those diseases are called zoonoses. Zoonosis is a human disease which originates in an animal reservoir. And there are just thousands of them, and many really serious and important diseases. But I only want you to know a few of them. By far the most important in human terms is influenza. Influenza has, on a global basis, over all of the millennia, has probably killed more human beings than any other disease. Influenza is always potentially an extremely serious disease. And it moves, as I told you earlier, between these three reservoirs, between humans, pigs, and poultry. And unfortunately, in moving in between those reservoirs, it gets modified so that we keep on seeing brand new influenza viruses arising from these interactions between these three reservoirs. There are many other viruses which spread from animal reservoirs. One of them is rabies. Rabies exists in many, many mammal populations. It can infect almost any mammal. It is maintained in animal reservoirs and then periodically enters the human population, often through contact with animals that are rabid. Either just handling them is enough. If it's a pet that is rabid, people may be handling it, often by a bite, but the virus is conferred by saliva. So another one to think about is HIV, human immunodeficiency virus. Human immunodeficiency virus is actually a zoonosis, but it has been in the human population for long enough that it's become a purely human disease. There is no animal reservoir for HIV, even though it originated in animal populations. It is still regarded as a zoonosis, but there is no animal reservoir for HIV. It is adapted entirely to the human population. Our current virus, SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19 is the disease that results. That appears to have arisen in bats, and there is a bat reservoir. And Ebola, I've already told you about. Bacterial diseases, there are also many where there are animal reservoirs. And some of these, when we get, many of these may be actually quite well tolerated by the animal reservoir, but we can suffer in very intense illness with a very high mortality and certainly a high morbidity from many of these diseases. And for example, this disease, anthrax, is caused by a bacterium called Bacillus anthracus. And it exists widely in wild animals. It often makes its entrance into cattle, sheep, these sort of, and can cause an intense acute illness with high mortality in cattle, but can also be very well tolerated in wild animals and in certain domesticated animals as well, and be conferred to human beings, in whom it can be fatal. We'll hear more about that when we talk about infectious disease. Plague, this is caused by a bacterium called Pasteurella pestis, and plague is endemic in rodents. And often is extremely well tolerated by rodents, so that it can be maintained for a very long time and then make its way into human populations. Of course, plague, gave the name to the plagues. In the Middle Ages was widespread epidemics with very, very high mortalities. Nowadays, not at all. Plague is very easily treated with antibiotics and seldom becomes epidemic. Salmonellosis, I'm going to mention, because this is one of the ones we pick up this bacterium Salmonella and suffer from violent diarrhea, vomiting as a result. I'm just mentioning this Salmonella. We do pick it up often from food poisoning, But people who keep birds and reptiles, you need to be extremely careful, because in birds and reptiles are a well-known reservoir for salmonella, and they tolerate it extremely well. They are not ill themselves, but they certainly can give it to you. And whenever you handle birds or reptiles, you should be extremely careful not to put your hands anywhere near your mouth, and make sure that you wash your hands extremely well after handling them. There are some milder ones. Ringworm, for example, we often acquire from other animals, from pets, and that sort of thing. There are several protozoa which can be transferred. This one, Giardia, is a very common cause of diarrhea and vomiting, but we usually acquire it from water sources. And I'll tell you a more complex story later on about Giardia, but it is often regarded as being a higher population in water sources which are contaminated with rodent feces and that sort of thing. But this one is an interesting one, toxoplasmosis. Toxoplasmosis is a protozoal disease in cats, especially. And it has very little effect on cats at all. But they shed it in their feces. And human beings can very definitely acquire toxoplasmosis. What is interesting about toxoplasmosis is it's believed that it can be a silent infection in the brain and can actually affect the functioning of the brain. And there is some suspicion that in some cases of mental illness might actually be exacerbated by toxoplasmosis. Certainly, no pregnant women, people who are immunocompromised should never, never, never clean cat litter. They should have somebody else do it for them, or else be masked and gloved when they do so. And lastly, many of our parasites, tapeworm, roundworm, these sorts of things, are actually held in animal reservoirs, and we acquire them often from consuming animal products. So this brings us to the issue of transmission. And for many of the diseases we are going to be talking about when we talk about viral and bacterial diseases after this, many of those require direct contact transmission. So there's got to be a close association between an infected person or an infected reservoir member and then the future host. That is very commonly the case. Congenital transmission is transmission from mother to either to the fetus or to the newborn at birth. And there are several, especially viral diseases, where this can occur. Indirect contact transmission refers to the fact that some disease-causing agents will survive, for example, on a surface. Any inanimate object which can host an infectious agent is referred to as a fomite. So a fomite, for example, can be something like a table. Somebody who's infected with something spreads the infectious agent on the table, it remains there, and then somebody else comes along and picks it up inadvertently and infects themselves. That would be a typical example of fomite transmission. Fomite transmission is extremely important and very important, especially in hospitals. This is why they obsessively clean surfaces, because surfaces can act as a way station for infection to take place. The last one is one which should concern us very much nowadays, and this is droplet transmission. When we speak, even if you're not speaking loudly, even if you're breathing, for example, with your mouth open, we produce a fog of very small droplets of moisture the whole time. And those droplets have a survival time in the air. We usually regard droplet transmission as being transmission by droplets within about a meter or so, which is where the 6 feet rule comes from for social distancing. It's 2 meters. It's 1 meter from this person, 1 meter from that person. Okay, gives you 2 meters, which is about 6 feet apart. In fact, we know that droplets may survive for more than that. They may actually be kept up suspended in the air for a long time and drift further than a meter. But your major risk would be when you're relatively close to another person. Remember, this is not the inadvertent spit drop that you see flying across and then you get embarrassed and you don't know what to do. These are droplets which we all produce as we're talking, breathing. We even produce droplets from our noses while we're breathing. So these are continually circulating around us and can contain infectious particles, which is why, of course, at the moment, we're particularly reliant on wearing masks, both to catch our own droplets, prevent them from spreading, but also to stop picking up droplets from the air. Okay, I think I'm going to just finish with this slide and talk to you. This takes us back to the idea of inanimate reservoirs. I mentioned, for example, how cholera was transmitted by water, etc. We recognize 3 major inanimate reservoirs. The first is the airborne reservoir, and that's what we've just talked about. This population of droplets in the air that we are continually exposed to that may contain infectious agents, especially virus. It's not so important for bacteria. There are 1 or 2 bacteria where it may be important, tuberculosis being one of them, but it's much more important for viruses. The second vehicle of transmission is waterborne disease, which is hugely important on a population basis around the world. Diseases like cholera and many other diseases which are carried and stored in water, survive in water sources to be transmitted. And then lastly, the foodborne transmission. Food as a vehicle transmits, especially bacterial disease, extremely well, because food not only provides a protective environment, it provides nutrients, and very often is kept at a temperature which is highly suitable for bacteria to grow, especially. Okay, so, and I'm going to leave it there for today. We'll finish this and move on to our discussion about viruses in our next class.